The telegram had arrived 3 weeks ago, crisp and formal, confirming the arrangement. Margaret Hayes stood on the platform at Bitter Creek Station, her hands twisting the fabric of her gray traveling dress until the wool threatened to pill. The September wind swept across the Wyoming plains, carrying with it the smell of sagebrush and the promise of an early winter. She had worn her best dress, the one with the modest lace collar her mother had tatted before the fever took her. Her hair was pinned in a respectable bun, and she'd even dabbed a bit of rose water behind her ears, though she felt foolish for it now. The train's whistle pierced the afternoon air, and Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She had done this. She had actually placed an advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper, written careful letters to a man she'd never met, and agreed to marry him sight unseen. At 28, she was well past the age when most women married, especially out here in the territories where men outnumbered women 5-1. But her father's ranch needed a man's hands, and she needed security. It was practical, sensible, nothing more. The locomotive hissed to a stop, great clouds of steam billowing across the platform. Passengers began to disembark, families reuniting, businessmen hurrying toward the town. Margaret scanned each face, looking for the man she'd exchanged letters with for 6 months. Samuel Garrett, he'd signed himself. A former schoolteacher from Philadelphia, seeking a fresh start in the West. His letters had been thoughtful, even poetic at times, describing his love of literature and his desire for a quiet life. He'd sent a photograph, a formal portrait showing a slender man with kind eyes and a neat mustache. She waited and waited. The platform began to clear. Perhaps he'd changed his mind. Perhaps he'd taken one look at the desolate landscape and decided civilization was more to his liking after all. Margaret felt relief and disappointment war within her chest in equal measure. Then she saw him. The man who stepped off the rear car bore no resemblance to the photograph she'd studied by candlelight. He was tall, broad, shouldered in a way that strained against his dark coat. His face was harder, weathered by wind and sun, with a jaw shadowed by several days' growth of beard. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanently skeptical expression, and at his hip, visible when his coat shifted in the wind, hung a gun belt with a well-worn revolver. He scanned the platform with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, the kind of gaze that catalogued threats and exits in a single sweep. When those eyes landed on Margaret, they narrowed slightly. He picked up a worn traveling bag and walked directly toward her. "Miss Hayes," his voice was rough, like gravel underfoot. Margaret took an involuntary step backward. Who are you?" "I'm Samuel Garrett." He set down his bag and reached into his coat. Margaret's breath caught, but he only produced a letter, her letter, with her own handwriting across the envelope. "I believe we have an arrangement." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "No, you're not. Samuel Garrett is a schoolteacher from Philadelphia. He's refined, educated. He doesn't carry a gun and look like a what?" There might have been amusement in his tone, but his expression remained unreadable. "I ordered a husband, not a stranger with a gun." Margaret's voice rose, and several people on the platform turned to stare. She felt heat flood her cheeks, but stood her ground. "You're an impostor. I don't know what kind of scheme this is, but I won't be party to it." The man calling himself Samuel Garrett studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he sighed. It was a weary sound, as if he carried weights she couldn't see. "There's a cafe across the street. Give me 15 minutes to explain. If you still want me on the next train back east, I'll go without argument." Margaret knew she should refuse, should turn on her heel and return to her father's ranch alone. But curiosity, that dangerous old serpent, whispered in her ear. 15 minutes, she said stiffly, no more. The café was nearly empty in the mid-afternoon lull. They took a table by the window, and the waitress brought coffee without being asked. Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm cup, but didn't drink. Across from her, the stranger sat with his back to the wall, a habit she recognized from the gunslingers and drifters who occasionally passed through town. "I am Samuel Garrett," he began, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "The photograph I sent was taken 8 years ago, before the war. I was a schoolteacher in Philadelphia. That part was true. And the rest. I enlisted in '61, fought in Virginia and Pennsylvania. The war changes men, Miss Hayes. I came back to Philadelphia in '65 and found I couldn't stand in front of a classroom anymore. The children seemed too loud, the room too small. I'd wake in the night thinking I heard artillery." Margaret's grip on her coffee cup tightened. The war had taken many things from many people. She'd lost 2 cousins at Shiloh and an uncle at Gettysburg. "I drifted west," he continued. "Worked as a ranch hand, a wagon guard, a deputy marshal for a time in Kansas. I learned to shoot because out here, a man who can't protect himself doesn't last long. But I got tired, Miss Hayes. Tired of moving, of violence, of having no place to call home." He met her eyes directly. "Your advertisement spoke of a ranch, of building something permanent. That's what I want, what I need. A chance to be Samuel Garrett the schoolteacher again, not Samuel Garrett the gunfighter. You lied about who you are. I told you who I was, who I used to be, and who I want to become. The man in that photograph still exists, Miss Hayes. He's just buried under 8 years of trying to survive." Margaret should have been angry. She was angry. But beneath the anger was something else, a recognition she didn't want to acknowledge. Hadn't she done the same in her own letters? Described herself as a capable ranch woman who enjoyed homemaking, leaving out the parts about her temper, her stubborn streak, her habit of reading novels when she should be mending. Hadn't she presented the version of herself she thought he'd want? The gun, she said. "If you want a quiet life, why bring it? Because the West isn't tame yet, no matter what the railroad companies advertise. There are still men who take what they want from those who can't defend themselves." His jaw tightened. "I've seen what happens to isolated ranches, to women alone. I'd be a poor husband if I couldn't protect what's mine. I'm not yours yet," Margaret said sharply. "We haven't spoken vows." "No," he agreed. "We haven't, which is why I'm giving you the choice. I won't hold you to an agreement made under false pretenses. But I'm asking you to consider whether the man I am now might still be the man you need." Margaret looked out the window at the dusty street, at the mountains rising in the distance. Her father's ranch was 15 miles north, carved out of wilderness with his own hands 30 years ago. Since the stroke had left him partially paralyzed last spring, she'd been managing it alone with help from a single aging ranch hand. They needed someone strong, someone capable, someone who could handle the brutal work of cattle ranching in country that killed the weak and unlucky. She'd wanted a gentleman, a man of letters who would bring culture and refinement to their isolated home. But what use was poetry to a woman whose cattle were being rustled? What good were philosophical discussions when the winter feed needed stocking and the barn roof needed repair? "Tell me about Philadelphia," she said suddenly. "Tell me about teaching." Samuel Garrett's expression softened, and for the first time she saw a glimpse of the man in the photograph. "I taught literature and history to boys aged 12 to 16. My favorite was always teaching them to parse Shakespeare, watching their faces when they first understood the beauty of the language beneath the archaic words. I had a student once, a blacksmith's son, who had no business being a scholar by any practical measure, but he loved Hamlet. memorized whole soliloquies. Last I heard, he'd gone to university on scholarship. Do you still read? When I can. I have a complete Shakespeare in my bag and a volume of Emerson, the bindings coming loose on both. Margaret made her decision. It was probably foolish. It was certainly impulsive. But she'd learned over the years running her father's ranch that sometimes you had to trust your instincts about a person, and her instincts were telling her that Samuel Garrett, whatever else he might be, was honest. The ranch is 3 hours by wagon, she said. We can speak with Pastor Mitchell tomorrow about the ceremony. He'll want to wait a few days, make sure we're both certain. I assume you can handle horses. I can. And cattle. Have you worked with cattle? 2 years in Texas. I know my way around a branding iron and a lasso. Then we have an agreement, Mr. Garrett. Provisional, pending the next few days. Something that might have been relief crossed his features. Thank you, Miss Hayes. I won't give you cause to regret this. See that you don't. The wagon ride to the ranch was largely silent. Samuel sat beside her on the bench, his long coat pulled against the evening chill. He didn't try to make conversation, and Margaret appreciated that. She needed time to process what she'd done, to prepare herself for introducing this armed stranger to her father as her intended husband. The ranch came into view as the sun touched the western peaks, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. It wasn't much. A main house, a barn, a bunkhouse, and corrals that held perhaps 200 head of cattle. But it was hers, or would be someday, and she felt pride swell in her chest. It's beautiful, Samuel said quietly. It's home. Her father was on the porch, seated in the chair where he spent most of his days now. Jacob Hayes had been a giant of a man before the stroke, but illness had shrunk him, left one side of his face slack and his right arm useless. His eyes, though, were still sharp as flint. "Papa, this is Samuel Garrett," Margaret said, helping him from the wagon. The man I've been corresponding with." Jacob looked Samuel up and down, his gaze lingering on the gun belt. "Thought you said he was a schoolteacher." "I was, sir," Samuel said, extending his left hand when he realized Jacob's right was impaired. "And I hope to be again, in whatever capacity your daughter's ranch school might need. But I've learned other skills in the intervening years. So I see." Jacob's handshake was surprisingly strong. "You know how to use that iron you're carrying." "I do. Good. Had some trouble last month. Rustlers. Lost 15 head before they moved on. Can you shoot as well as you can shake hands? Better." Jacob smiled, a lopsided thing that was more familiar to Margaret than his old full grin. "Then you might do, schoolteacher. Might do indeed." Over the next 3 days, Margaret watched Samuel Garrett prove himself. He rose before dawn, worked alongside their ranch hand Tom without complaint, and handled a horse like he'd been born in the saddle. He fixed the barn roof, reinforced the corral fences, and somehow convinced their stubborn bull that being led to pasture wasn't a negotiable matter. But it was the evenings that surprised her most. After supper, while Jacob dozed by the fire, Samuel would pull out his battered Shakespeare and read aloud. His voice, so rough in normal conversation, smoothed into something almost musical when he recited the verses. Margaret found herself looking forward to those readings, to the way poetry sounded in the lamplight. On the third night, he read Sonnet 116. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove." "Do you believe that," Margaret asked when he finished, "that love doesn't change?" Samuel closed the book carefully. "I believe love is a choice we make and remake every day. The feeling might change, but the commitment doesn't have to, not if both people are willing to do the work." Is that what this is? Work? The best kind. He met her eyes across the room, building something worth, while always is. They married on Sunday in the small church, with Pastor Mitchell officiating and half the town in attendance. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and Samuel had shaved for the occasion, revealing a strong jawline beneath the beard. He looked almost like the man in the photograph, though his eyes still carried shadows no razor could remove. When Pastor Mitchell pronounced them man and wife, Samuel kissed her gently, respectfully, and Margaret felt the weight of her decision settle over her like a warm cloak. The trouble came 2 weeks later. Margaret was hanging laundry when she heard the gunshots, 3 sharp cracks from the direction of North Pasture. Her blood turned to ice. Samuel had ridden out that morning to check on the cattle that grazed near Black Creek. Tom had gone to town for supplies. Her father was inside, unable to help. She ran for the house, grabbing the rifle from above the fireplace. Her hands shook as she loaded it, and she was halfway to the barn to saddle a horse when she saw riders coming fast up the road, 3 of them pushing cattle ahead of them, and behind, riding hard, was Samuel. The rustlers saw her and changed direction, spurring their horses toward the house. Margaret raised the rifle. Knowing she was a mediocre shot at best, knowing 3 against 1 was impossible odds, but she'd die before she let anyone take what her family had built. Then Samuel was there, pulling his horse between her and the rustlers. His gun was already drawn. That's far enough. The lead rustler, a hard-faced man with tobacco-stained teeth, laughed. 3 of us, schoolteacher. Put down the gun and maybe we'll just take the cattle. No. Something in that single word made the rustlers pause. Margaret recognized it too, the absolute finality, the voice of a man who'd made his choice and wouldn't be moved. Your call, Samuel said calmly, but know that I'm a fair shot, very fair. I can put 3 bullets in 3 targets in the time it takes you to draw. I've done it before. I'd rather not do it again, but I will protect what's mine. The tension stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Margaret barely breathed. Then the lead rustler spat in the dust and wheeled his horse around. Ain't worth it. Come on, boys. They galloped away, leaving the cattle milling confused in the yard. Samuel holstered his gun, but didn't move until the rustlers were out of sight. Then he dismounted and walked to Margaret, gently taking the rifle from her white-knuckled grip. Are you hurt? His hands were steady on her shoulders, his eyes searching her face. No. You could have been killed, but I wasn't. He pulled her close, and she felt his heart hammering against her cheek, betraying the calm he'd shown. I told you I'd protect what's mine, Margaret. I meant it. That night, after the cattle were settled and Tom had returned with wild stories of seeing the rustlers ride through town at full gallop, Margaret sat with Samuel on the porch. Stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any city lights. I was frightened, she admitted, when I heard the shots. I thought, I know. He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. I was frightened too. Not of them, of failing you. Of proving I couldn't leave the violence behind after all. You didn't draw first. No, you gave them a choice. Everyone deserves a choice. Margaret thought about choices, about the one she'd made 3 weeks ago on a train platform. She'd wanted a gentleman scholar, someone refined and safe. Instead, she'd gotten a man who read Shakespeare and could face down 3 armed men without flinching, a man who'd been a teacher and a soldier, who carried both poetry and a gun, who was trying to build a new life from the broken pieces of his old one. I'm glad you stayed, she said softly, even though you weren't who I expected. Maybe especially because you weren't who I expected. Samuel lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles in a gesture that was pure gentleman. I'm glad you gave me a chance. I know I'm not the man in the photograph anymore. No, Margaret agreed, you're better. You're real. In the months that followed, they built their life together. Samuel proved to be everything the ranch needed: a tireless worker, a skilled hand, and a man who could handle trouble when it came. But he was also the husband Margaret hadn't known she needed. Someone who read to her father in the evenings, who taught her to see beauty in the harsh landscape, who kissed her awake on cold mornings and made her laugh with dry observations about their stubborn livestock. The gun stayed, hung on a peg by the door. Samuel cleaned it regularly, but rarely wore it unless riding far from the ranch. It was a tool, like his lasso or his shovel, a reminder of who he'd been and the skills that kept them safe. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work was done and the stars were bright, Margaret would watch him read by lamplight and think about that day on the train platform. She'd been so certain of what she wanted, so sure she'd ordered the wrong husband when a stranger with a gun stepped off the train, but she'd been wrong. She hadn't ordered a husband at all. She'd found one, battered and scarred and perfect in his imperfections. A man who'd traveled a hard road to find his way home, and home, they'd both learned, wasn't about being what you were. It was about becoming who you needed to be together. The ranch prospered, and so did they.